Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers is a weekly program designed to answer all your questions, including the ones you didn't even know you had, and to clarify the endless debates around the wonderful and fascinating world of sexuality. Join us for real talk about sex from two experts in the field. Richard and Larry Siegel have over 50 years of experience as sex therapists, educators, counselors, and researchers. The Siegel brothers are recognized around the world as trainers of medical and mental health professionals.
Hello and welcome to Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. I'm Larry Siegel, a clinical sexologist and certified sexuality educator.
And I'm Ricky Siegel, a certified sex therapist and supervisor.
And my brother, I am always proud to say, and like to start a traditional sake toast. First to you, my brother.
My awesome big brother.
And to you all for joining us this and every Friday night.
Welcome to Sex Talk. You well?
I am. And how about yourself? How's the
Very
week?
Well, busy.
Yeah, as it should be.
But I'm excited. We have an interesting topic for tonight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really do.
We are going to be talking about polyamory, a concept that draws lots of questions, lots of confusion, lots of controversy, especially among our fellow boomers. It's one of those topics. And like we say a lot, right? Everything old is new again.
Right.
It's not like something that millennials invented. Like everything else in the world of sexuality, it's been around for as long as humankind has.
That's right.
I'm sure there's natural polyamory that occurs in the animal kingdom.
Yes.
Right?
There is.
It's just us, naked apes, that carry on the most about, oh my God, it's so wrong, it's so weird, it's so kinky, what's wrong with these people?
Well,
they're perverts, they're deviants.
Specifically, it's the puritanical naked apes. Right? It's those that have that kind of history and legacy of sexual shame and discomfort and just sex negativity. People forget who the Puritans are. And for those of you who do know who the Puritans are, hopefully you've already hit the subscribe button. And you've been tuning in. You've been kind of getting some of the skinny that we've been putting out there for the last however long we've been doing this. We'd certainly ask all of you who are listening and watching, hit that like button, hit the notification button. You'll always know when a new show is coming. Follow us on Facebook, like and share as much as you can. Let's help get this out. And then maybe something like polyamory wouldn't be as confusing for a lot of people as it tends to be. But I want to repeat what you just said, because I think it is definitely something that bears repeating. This is nothing new. This is not something that, these new progressives or whoever just came up with just to kind of throw a monkey wrench into the way things work. This has always been something there. And again, we've always had the Mike Huckabee-like people who would use that term and say, oh, hey, I want to be polyamorous. That'll let me go out and cheat on my spouse and sleep with whoever I want. That's not polyamory.
I'm sure there are lines of women, including his wife, that are just waiting to get into bed with that sexy dude.
Ah, sure.
Right.
Sure.
But there's just a lot of misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. And I would say also from my clinical practice, I've seen mostly guys, a couple of women, but mostly guys who will use this claim, I'm polyamorous, you knew this going in, so I'm going to screw whoever I want and you have to be okay with it. So there's a difference between someone who identifies as a lifestyle or a sexual identity versus a narcissist who wants to have his cake and eat it.
An excuse. Exactly. The narcissistic entitlement.
It's like, I'm not cheating. I told you I was poly. I can't be held down to one person. I need lots of people. Is that really polyamory? Or is that an asshole?
Well, I think that is an asshole in a shitty relationship, because on both sides, if that's what defined a relationship, and he has any kind of room to say, well, I told you that I like this already. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously this was never agreed upon.
Right.
This was never an arrangement. This was never an understanding. This was maybe this person, this hypothetical person you're speaking of, actually did make a comment to that effect. I doubt it, because more often than not, it's that kind of, that sort of I knew it all along phenomenon, right? That I never said anything, but once it happened, oh, I told you that this was going to happen. No, you didn't.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't. And certainly it was not consensual. And like I said, it was not an agreement. Right? So again, that's not a polyamorous relationship. You can't have somebody in any type of relationship dynamic and they're the only ones that either are or know that they are poly.
Folks might have heard these acronyms before: CNM or ENM, right? Standing for consensual non-monogamy or ethical non-monogamy. And of course, both of them share the theme that consent is really at the core of the issue. You can't step out if you have an understanding of monogamy in a relationship and you break that trust, you violate that promise, that vow. You don't have the right to then, after the fact, say, oh, well, this is my identity, right? That should be negotiated.
Yeah, well, exactly. And again, I think the 3 C's that characterize any good relationship are still in effect, right? You've got the consent, the communication, and there has to be comfort.
Excellent.
Right? So those three C's, I think, underlie all relationships. And if they're not there, you really don't have the kind of relationship you think you do. Especially in the context of these more poly type relationships. Or non-monogamous. A non-monogamous relationship doesn't have to be a poly relationship. Right? And again, that's part of the thing that's confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah. So, like a lot of things, it's hot, it's trendy. People are talking more and more about it. It seems to be getting mainstreamed, but people tend to act like they're supposed to know, even if they don't. Right. It's not just adolescents; it's adults too. Nobody wants to look dorky or uncool or like they don't know something and have to ask. Right. So they just act like they assume they think they know what it is. Right. So I'm very glad for tonight's guest.
Yes, am I.
We have an expert and a colleague from our professional home, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, or ASECT. And someone that I've wanted to get to know better for a long time, someone we've known from conferences and trainings, a sex therapist from Madison, Wisconsin, named Martha Kauppi. And Martha's a marriage and family therapist, another of our favorite greatest hits rants, the marriage and family therapists, the ones who specialize in why people get married and how they have families. And usually the ones who least likely talk about sex. My old plumbers that don't do toilets analogy.
Exactly.
So Martha is a sex therapist and marriage and family therapist and a trainer, supervises other therapists who wish to become sex therapists, and she's also a professor and speaker, and now is promoting her brand new book, which we're really happy to talk about tonight, called Polyamory, a clinical toolkit for therapists and their clients. So, with one more celebratory toast of your wonderful, by the way, I didn't point out, your last minute alchemy, a delicious blended ginger sake, and obviously cloudy, unfiltered sake.
That's right, and Nagori sake.
Kudos to that. And
thank you.
Join us in welcoming Martha Kauppi. I'm very happy to greet our guest from Madison, Wisconsin. As we said, sex therapist and lecturer and author, and now announcing her new book called Polyamory, a clinical toolkit for therapists and their clients. Martha Kauppi, welcome. Thank you so much. Welcome to Sex Talk.
Thank you so much. I'm just really delighted to be here.
Thanks so much.
We're glad to have you. And all of us, especially those of us doing supervision, know that obviously it's an understatement to say it's a different world in the 21st century. And as every generation kind of redefines things for themselves, I would love if we can just start off with a general, broad definition of polyamory, since it seems more than ever it's kind of user defined these days. And anytime anyone talks about opening a relationship, like I said, it means a dozen different things. So what do you tell folks polyamory is about?
Well, polyamory, I think of as being a form of a consensually open relationship where it's assumed that one or both partners will have other romantic and or sexual relationships, operative words being consensual, open, and romance is involved, as opposed to, okay, you can go over there and do that thing, but don't get your heart all wrapped up in it, right? Mm-hmm. Polyamory is a thing where you go over and do that thing and you do get your heart all wrapped up in the thing.
Right. But how are there distinctions, and how do you make distinctions between things like swinging or, partner swapping, or a don't ask, don't tell kind of arrangement with open marriages versus a polyamorous identity or lifestyle?
Yeah, well, there is kind of a lexicon. So I would think of swinging as being primarily an activity that couples do together for the entertainment of the couple, usually involving other couples, usually at like meetup kind of events. And then sometimes those spin off as well. And sometimes they develop into polyamory, interestingly. But I would say most people who are in polyamorous relationships, they're going along maybe as a couple, and they develop an interest in another person, and rather than either engaging in infidelity or breaking monogamy agreements or whatever, they renegotiate to open their relationship. Or there's somebody who just sees themselves as being in a relationship with more than one person at a time. And so they always kind of imagine that, and whether or not they had words for it, now they want to explore that.
Yeah, I think that last piece that you mentioned, especially those people who define it in terms of just being in multiple relationships, I think, and again, I see how there's been an evolution of that as being a, for lack of a better word, legitimate type of consensual non-monogamous relationship. But I can remember years ago, whenever I heard somebody say that, it's like, well, I'm polyamorous. I'm in multiple relationships. One of my first questions always used to be, does your partner know that? Or do your partners know that? Because very often we'd hear people say, well, I'm polyamorous, which just means I'm cheating on my wife or my husband. And, the fact that I am, but they're not, they don't even know. So I think there's been an evolution of the concept, of the term. So when we look at this now as this sort of open, loving, usually multi-partner type of dynamic, is it the same when we look at, again, heterosexual versus non-heterosexual relationships? Do people define it kind of the same way in different worlds?
Let me see if I got that right. I'll do my best, and then let me know what I missed. I think people who are in polyamorous relationships, it is now absolutely assumed that we're talking about a form of consensual non-monogamy. And I think it's also assumed that we're talking about a form of consensual non-monogamy that incorporates some sort of romantic involvement. I think it's usually assumed that it's also a sexual involvement, but I draw a distinction there because some people are asexual and participate in polyamorous relationships. Sex is not required. The defining characteristic is consensual, open, and romance. So, and I do think that that crosses the demographic at this point. I think that's a pretty accepted definition. And there's a very strong distinction between any form of consensual non-monogamy and infidelity, of course. So the difference being, did you talk about it and explicitly make an agreement that this was something that one, some, or all partners were free to explore or not? And I also think it's important to realize that not always all partners are interested. So it's certainly possible to have one partner who has another partner or several other partners, and the other partner identifies as monogamous, but is in this polyamorous relationship.
That's something I want to ask you. As long as, we get an expert in such a specific topic, and I have so many thoughts in my head, so many questions, I probably should have taken the time to write them down today. But this, maybe some part of my head, it conjures images of like communal living in the 60s, but this notion of a polycule, right? Like a group of 4 or 5 or 6 people, live, all, equal partners in a relationship that's not just a dyad. But what really interests me and what I see much more often in practice these days is a couple, a dyad, a monogamous dyad, deciding to adopt a polyamorous lifestyle. So now they're making rules for themselves as a couple, but they're making rules for partners they haven't even met yet. And I hear terms like secondary partners and even tertiary partners. And I would think, obviously being naive to that world, I don't know how good I would feel being referred to as someone's secondary or third string partner. So could you share some thoughts on those distinctions?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot in what you just said. I could go on for a really long time. So just stop me when it's time. So there is a hierarchical way of doing non-monogamy that involves like having a primary dyad and then other relationships that are secondary. That not everybody does polyamory that way. Some people have a non-hierarchical way of doing polyamory, where each person sort of makes their own decisions about how they're going to allocate their time and attention and resources and stuff. And functionally, there's not a tremendous difference between the two of them, the hierarchical and non-hierarchical, if they're handled well. But if they're not handled well or problems are arising in therapy, for instance, there's quite a distinction between the two. And I think it's important to know how people are structuring their relationships and what are the power dynamics. For one thing, that's how I decide who I want to see in the first session. Like, I want the decision makers there, and I don't really want the non-decision makers there until I know what the treatment goals might be for the decision makers. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
a lot of sense. Yeah. So there's definitely, I think there's also a lot of people that assume that a polycule or any type of polyamorous dynamics, there's sort of that the power is equally shared. But it seems that there are statuses, definite statuses, and different kind of power differentials within those relationship dynamics.
In some relationships. So each one is going to be a little different. And let me just clarify a little language. I would use the word polycule to describe a constellation of interconnected people, regardless of their living situation, level of commitment, or power structure. And something where like 3 people are living together and making decisions as a family. I would call that a triad, and that's a family decision-making body. And there's also a quad, which is, 4 people making decisions all together as a family. So it is complicated. I mean, you're kind of pointing right at the places where people get a little confused. There are different power structures that people choose or that feel like a fit for them. There are different shapes of constellation of relationships. And then there are hierarchical issues within that. And then there are simply the kind of things that come along with regular life. Like, for instance, somebody might be non-hierarchical, but nesting partners, meaning they share a home and a mortgage and maybe children. So they might not have a hierarchy where there's a primary and a secondary, but, it would be honoring your partner to show up if the water heater broke, even if you had been on a date, right? So nesting partners sometimes seem like they have hierarchy, even if they don't have hierarchy, just because there are shared responsibilities with a home and a family.
And that's a good it's a good transition to another question I've been antsy to ask you about, and that is the book, because we know, unfortunately, all of us sex therapists and sexologists know that our field reflects the larger culture we serve. So generally speaking, our field kind of sucks when it comes to dealing with most sexuality issues, and most trained and licensed therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists, marriage and family therapists, couples counselors generally tend to freak out when they hear a couple come in and talk about these kind of alternate arrangements, alternate sexual lifestyles. So I couldn't help but notice that you wrote the book as a clinical toolkit for therapists and their clients. So this isn't necessarily like a how-to for just couples, folks interested in how do we open our marriage. This is really specifically the important skills that therapists need to know in working with polyamorous or poly-identified folks. Is that accurate?
Well, I wrote the book for multiple audiences. So first, I wrote the book for therapists because the therapists that I train really weren't getting any specific training in the kinds of clinical challenges that come up for people in open relationships, a cultural level of cultural competence to be able to not do harm and further marginalize an already marginalized group. And then it really takes some very robust relational therapy skills to work with complicated constellations like that. So I wrote it first for the therapists. And then I realized, wait a minute, a lot of people who are in polyamorous relationships really value personal growth and are very well resourced, have tons of insight, and just might have a difficult time finding a therapist, or might not want to go find a therapist because they're so in the closet and they have privacy concerns about it. And so then I actually rewrote the book to make sure that it would be accessible to a person or a couple who wants to open their relationship, or maybe who has tried and encountered problems, and or maybe a discussion group that wants to use it as a walkthrough. It's very, very robust. It's got 25 worksheets. It's got from a therapist perspective, this, and if you're using this as a self-help manual, that. So it really is for both audiences.
Excellent. Very good.
So if somebody was interested, let's say, and again, we've had, we've especially since, HIV in the 80s, that word monogamy has been hammered into people's heads. So for the last 40 years, with this nothing but monogamy rhetoric and just assault, if you will, on that idea, if somebody is now thinking of opening up their relationship, how would they even broach that subject, particularly in a way that, you're not going to prevent it, but you can help mitigate the partner's defensiveness?
Jealousy.
How do people not feel kind of dissed when their partner says they want to do this?
Really good question. And probably there are 4 questions in there if I really parsed it. So the one I'm going to tackle first is what about those feelings that come up? And, to me, feelings come up, and then there are ways to deal with feelings. And one of those ways to deal with feelings is to get some knowledge about what this actually looks like when it works. And I think one of the problems with the assault of monogamy, right, is that you're describing, is that people who are in open relationships are very closeted. And most therapists, of course, who we see as our clients are people who are having problems in their relationships. So most therapists don't get to look at really beautifully working open relationships. But there's a lot of overlap between marginalized sexual communities, in particular, the queer community, the polyamorous community, and the kinky community. And I'm in a same-sex relationship for 26 years with a woman I identify as a queer lesbian. I've known people who are in open relationships my whole entire life. I have family members who had open relationships. I'm like, it's just part of the fabric of what I have seen as I grew up and became a professional. And so then when I was going to therapy school and learning, ooh, monogamy is the only way to experience true intimacy. And oh gosh, that couldn't possibly last, could it? That just sounds like such a shaky construct. And I was like, this does not compute. Like, I know people who have workable relationships like this. So what really is the case here? And so I did research as part of my master's program to just look at the demographics a little bit and the longevity of polyamorous relationships, just to settle my own mind. Like, who's got the truth here? And the results of my study definitely matched the experience that I had just witnessing people's relationships. There's no reason to think that adding another partner diminishes the intimacy in the first relationship. There's no reason to think that these relationships can't stand the test of time. The average length of relationship was over 8 years, and the largest category was 12 and over. I mean, it's just very clear that it's not just a fly-by-night excuse to have sex with a bunch of different people, essentially treat your partner like crap, commit infidelity, but like get a gold star at the same time. It's not that. Right. It clearly takes some serious relationship chops to make this work, but those are learnable skills, and emotional regulation is part of it. Differentiation is a big part of it, being able to figure out what you think separate from what somebody else wants you to think, and getting grounded enough to say it, staying grounded and reaching for curiosity when somebody else tells you something that's uncomfortable for you to hear. For instance, my darling, I developed a crush on my coworker, and I think I'm not really willing to walk away from all thought of having a brand new relationship in my life. We've been married for 25 years, or we've been married for 5 years, or we've been married for 35 years. And I would love to have that experience again. Could we just talk about whether there's a way that could be comfortable for both of us?
Wow. That was so well said.
Yeah.
And then, I've said for years, the worst ideas that couples can have to try and save a shaky relationship are to A, have a kid or another kid, or B, open it up. And both of those are just going to bring way more stress and crap if the relationship isn't on a really solid foundation first. And discussions about jealousy. Could you say a word or two about how that's discussed in the therapy setting with couples discussing this kind of lifestyle change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think culturally, we have some assumptions about jealousy that we don't have about other emotions. So, I mean, I obviously have thought about this for a number of years. And I think that jealousy is pretty closely related to anxiety. And I think that when a client tells us, I have lots of anxiety about blah, 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 we think, oh, and it's probably out of proportion to what's really going on. And we can help you regulate that thing so that you can have a happier life. But when we hear somebody say, I feel jealous when my partner is out having sex with some other person, we think that partner is doing you wrong. And by God, you need to leave that asshole. So, I think that is that's a huge split. And that's a real problem.
But that's such a great answer. That's such a great comparison, really. So remember that experience at an ASEC conference? I think we were chairing or somehow. It was a year when Dossie Easton was presenting her famous book, The Ethical Slut, which now I'm happy to say it will be probably the second most common book I would recommend to folks asking about this, behind your new one. And we had to do like a little intervention. This woman was so
it was a plenary session.
And she was so incensed and so angered that who is this woman telling me my heterosexual relationship is boring and no good, and we were like, what? Were we listening to the same lecture?
Exactly. Didn't hear any of that.
She wasn't telling people everyone should be poly and you're square and no fun if you're monogamous. So I think there's a lot of people tend to think of all of us sex therapists as weirdos that are pushing kink. Everybody should be kinky. Everybody should be open and like this is part of some, I guess it's a conservative fear that we're too open and progressive and permissive sexually, that this is just part of that trend. What would your response to that be?
Well, I would say, wouldn't it be amazing if we could live in a world where diversity was honored?
Huh. Right?
Mhm.
You know, this is just another kind of diversity. This is another marginalized population. And when we hear stuff like, oh gosh, they're coming to get us, they're pushing it on us, we know we're talking about a marginalized population, don't we? People are scared. And so what I want to say is, you're only shakeable if you are shakeable. Like, you're I'm not going to tempt anybody into, you know, my whole thing is differentiation. This is like a 500-page book about figuring out what the heck you actually want and saying it to your partner. That is really the Cliff Notes version in one sentence. And if what you really want is hell no, not this, for goodness sake, say it. But don't say, oh yeah, let's go to couples therapy and talk about opening our relationship, and I'll run a bunch of experiments, but I'm going to beat you up the whole entire time because I don't want to be here. That, you know, then I'm going to have an opportunity to say, wait a minute, what is it really that you want for yourself? And what does the relationship that you want to build feel like, include, encompass? How do you live forward in it? And if your partner wants it to be an open relationship and you want to consider that, then I am going to ask you, are you sure that the security and the comfort and the stability that you seek has to go with monogamy? Or are you willing to consider the possibility that all the things that you want in a relationship might not be related to the shape of the relationship? It might be related to you speaking up about what's important to you and having a partner that's responsive to what you like and need.
Really good.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah. It brings to mind another question, maybe a little bit broadened to, I guess, kink in general, but something else I've seen a lot and supervised a lot of folks through. When one member of a couple has an interest and they're encouraging their partner to explore with them, and their partner desires to be, you know, in the famous words of Dan Savage, good, giving, and game, right? GGG.
Yeah.
And is willing, but very often the more eager, enthusiastic one gets all excited and says, oh, great, you'll try. And then there's a lot of pressure that's put on. Like the second partner loses the right sometimes, or it seems, to say, I was willing to try. I tried it. I don't like it. I don't want to do that with you. And then the first one starts like, oh man, you said you try.
Mhm.
And so navigating that when the less enthusiastic partner is feeling unheard.
Yeah. Well, you're describing a series of the kind of things that come up when you do therapy with people in polyamorous relationships. So I have like entire chapters about each of these topics. And
obviously not read a copy yet, which I intend to fix soon.
Fair enough. No problem. It just came out. So I think, you know, the dilemma of one partner wants to open and the other partner doesn't want to open is a really interesting one. And I think that, and it is like my wheelhouse. I love working with those specific situations because those are people who have a damn hard time finding a therapist who can stick with it and come up with something other than it's either or, right? Mm-hmm. And it's so much more than either or. There's so much room to explore once we kind of set aside the idea that right now we have to make a decision. That's the first thing. Like, let's take the decision out of it so we can get the discussion to a more meta level. Mm-hmm. And go on a quest together. How the hell do people actually do this? What does it look like? Let's go find some ones that are working. Let's talk to them. How do they do it? How do you feel? How do you handle it? What's it like? I'm scared about this. How do you handle that? Oh yeah, I've experienced that. This is how we do it. Like, go do that research project and then see where you're at. So that's one piece of advice I have. And as a therapist, I would say to other therapists, just, you know, for the purpose of normalizing this kind of situation and bringing the therapist panic down, this is not that different from other great big kinds of gridlock. And so I'm not talking about like how the dishes are done or whatever. I'm talking about big stuff like, I want to have my elderly parents live with us in their final days, and you're not so sure. That kind of thing where the emotions run high, you really need a collaborative solution. It's not going to work unless everybody's on the same page, and it matters a lot to everybody involved. It's like that. And that's not an easy course of therapy, but it's not an impossible one. It's just when we slide in this marginalized population, this idea of polyamory, and everybody freaks out, now it's starting to get pretty impossible. But if the therapist is like, no, I understand the structure of this, I get how to work with this kind of impasse. We take it to a higher level, we go on a quest, we take away the push-pull, we definitely break all coercion and try to figure out, like, get into a space of curiosity where the couple can work as a team to examine from all angles and hopefully, honestly, come up with a solution that's neither here nor there, that's somewhere out in the ether that we couldn't have possibly known before we went on the quest. And then the magic is worked that is not a matter of compromise, either yours or mine or half of each. Like, what kind of BS is that for a long-term relationship? We need something way better. And for me, I would call it relationship magic. And that's what we do as relational therapists.
And it's also a far cry from that traditional way of looking at it. It's like, well, one of these two has to win. Either one gets their way or the other one gets their way.
Right.
And that really should not be defining the work.
Negotiation, right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of something in the vapors or in the water or in the air or something, my final question for you is, what in the world is it about Madison, Wisconsin, that there are so many wonderful sex therapists that it's so, I mean, we're like coastal people, East Coast, West Coast. So, we have to get over that snobby flyover thing. But Madison is so cool and so sex positive. And there's so many of you. There's such a great, strong cohort of brilliant sex therapists in Madison. So what is it about that part of the country?
What is it about Madison? Well, we're chilly. I wonder if that has something to do with it.
We're sex
Close.
I don't know. I think Madison is a surprisingly cool town. It's very socially liberal in the middle of a fairly conservative state. One of the thing I like most about Madison is it's got like the best biking that I've ever seen anywhere. You can bike everywhere on like dedicated bike paths or really nice bike lanes. It's like the best place to be outdoors on a bike. It's got lakes all over the place. It's a really cool place. So maybe just really cool people come here, all except for like the ones like you that just fly over. But I think you should probably come visit.
We did. We had a wonderful opportunity. We did some trainings out there a few years back. And of course, have known the stalwarts like Gretchen Fink and we've had Amy Gilliland on the show, and I've had I'm having the pleasure of supervising a couple of new sex therapists. It's great. I hope we'll come back someday.
That's awesome. Amy lives 2 blocks that way from me. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful and glad that we had this chance. Like I said, kind of conference pals for many years, but never really had a chance to talk like this. And I'm delighted that we could. And I'm happy for you and congratulations and kudos on this groundbreaking new book.
Yeah, I really hope it gets out there the way it needs to.
We will post your contact information for folks who want to get in touch with you for questions, or folks in Madison who may want to see you, and certainly let everybody know to go to their favorite bookseller online or brick and mortar if they have any interest at all in finding out about more about polyamory, and particularly for our fellow sexologists and therapists and researchers and educators and counselors.
There it is.
Hold it up there. There it is.
Your bookshelf.
They told me to pet it. Every time I can show it, I should pet it. So I'm petting my book. I'm trying to learn how to be Vanna. Pet.
Stuff, right. So once more, Martha Kauppi, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you so much. It's just lovely to talk to you tonight.
Thanks.
All the best.
Pleasure.
You know, it's I not only enjoyed the conversation, but I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too.
You know, that doesn't always happen. I know it's not really supposed to say that, you know, but there's really more enjoying of the conversations that we always had, but I don't always really learn something from them. But
Right.
I really did.
Well, one of my favorite things to say, I say this in supervision all the time, my students must be sick of me, but one of my favorite things about this field of sexuality and sexology, the study of sex and sexuality, is you can study it for 200 years and you won't finish.
Right.
Right? It's not a topic like organic chemistry, where an organic chemist can say, I'm confident I know everything we know about organic chemistry to this point.
Right. To this point.
Right. But sexuality, nobody can be an expert in everything.
Right.
There's limitless, endless forms of sexual expression.
Mm-hmm.
Things that baffle us, that, you know, how do people even find this sexy?
Right.
But people do.
Yeah.
And it's just wonderful that you can
Yeah.
spend a whole career and always feel green, always feel like you're constantly learning, and there's always something else to learn about.
Well, and things are changing. It's a very organic aspect of our life. It's a very organic field of study.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned organic chemistry. You know, speaking of organic, you know, I was a little, I'll say, shocked. I'm not sure exactly what the word was, but it didn't feel good. This last year, helping some of my students, current undergraduates, with chemistry, and I haven't seen a periodic table in a long time.
It's different?
It's completely different.
Really?
It's literally twice as big now as when we first learned it.
Well, we have
I
to
was looking on
memorize
it, it's
it.
like, what the hell is that? What the hell is that? What is that? Where'd that come from? It literally is twice as big when we had to learn and memorize the periodic table.
We're getting old.
So, you know, if that happens in chemistry, then when we talk about sex and sexuality, even more so. And, you know, I feel like I want to throw this in here as well, that while things are continuously changing and evolving, as people are evolving, attitudes, beliefs, values are also going to be evolving. But I also want people who are hearing this and maybe hearing some of this stuff for the first time, and it may be a little confusing. You know, you had referred to that incident at the conference with, you know, Dazi Eason. You know, I don't want anybody to think that this is an expected standard. Right. That, you know, and I don't want anybody to feel pressure that they're supposed to live up to these things. These are just other ways that people are now able to think about their relationships, create different kinds of relationship dynamics, and the truth of these relationships, the reality of these relationships is only true and real within the context of those relationships.
Right.
Right? Nobody else has to be doing this. This is not a new standard. And as you were saying before, how things do change and evolve and grow. You know, we may find in a couple of years from now that this is no longer an acceptable standard.
Huh.
Right? Just like this once was an unacceptable standard in favor of monogamy. Right? Now, we're not at a point where this is the acceptable standard instead of monogamy. Those of you who are in monogamous relationships, enjoy them. Make them as strong as you can. You don't have to change. But if you want to explore, if you want to try something new, this is a whole new world that you would be welcomed into.
Yeah. There was one thing I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk to Martha about. And that is, well, two things really. For the therapists among our viewers, polyamorous folks or families are generally not going to come to sex therapy because they're polyamorous.
Right.
Right? There's going to be some conflict, some relationship negotiation, some personal issues, some interpersonal issues, but you know, people
Martha
don't.
used that term impasse.
Right.
Yeah.
People don't come in and say, "Help us, we're poly," right?
Right.
Like there's something wrong with that. But I also want to share an observation that, at least in my clinical practice, I have seen Gen Zers and millennials handle these kinds of arrangements far more maturely and equitably, and, you know, without the kind of raging jealousy that I have seen in aging Gen Xers and Boomers who are, again, as we discussed, trying to open their marriage or find some spark or something like that. So
yeah, it's a matter of reference points. I think and that's also a really good point, that I think younger people have the advantage of not having a history, so they don't really have that sense of, well, this is how it's supposed to be. This is how it always was. And that's a fallback. We sometimes have to catch ourselves with that as well. But standards do change. They do evolve, as we said before. For me, to quote the great Billy Connolly, though times do change, standards must remain. So I think the idea of having standards is important, while at the same time acknowledging that they do change and they do evolve.
Right.
And I think we're in a place with that, the way we look at relationships right now. And I think people who really don't understand or don't approve, whatever the framing would be, of these more polyamorous and consensually non-monogamous relationships, you don't have to like it, you don't have to accept it, don't do it. But you don't have to shame people who do either. And by the same token, people who are into non-monogamous relationships and polyamorous relationships, and you want that to be your standard, don't shame the vanilla folk either.
That's right.
It's not that they're doing anything wrong, that they're not rising to your new standard. So I think that's where I think a lot of the trouble tends to lie, in how we look at some of these relationships. So I'm so glad that we were able to have that conversation.
Yeah. Thank you again, Martha. And our genius producer will put up Martha's contact information as the credits roll, maybe a picture of the book. And I guess we can call it a wrap.
I think so.
Right? That'll do it
it's a
for
good
this
point to
week's
wrap on.
episode of Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. We'll be here next Friday and hopefully every Friday at 7 p.m. on East Coast time. And hope to see you then.
Cheers. Stay well.
Thanks for watching Sex Talk with the Siegel Brothers. Join us each week on Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern. You can also follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay on top of the latest developments in the ever-changing world of sex and sexuality.